So as you all know, as you saw, we're going to be talking a little bit about fasting today. And this is our first presentation of the year. We've been a little bit slow getting off the ground with this sort of stuff. We started this last year, which went down really well, and we just want to continue that in supporting the community of the patients we're serving, the public as well, looking for answers in this space. You know, a lot of the people coming to us at the moment are obviously in the long COVID population or post-vax population, but a lot of the concepts we talk about in these types of lives are, you know, they relate to many different types of chronic illness. It's not just those two. So we're going to be touching upon a lot of different types of issues alongside what we talk about with long COVID as part of the topic today. So if I can just start the presentation off here. So you should all see that pretty well, and you should see my face in the top right hand corner. So why are we talking about fasting? Why do we want to talk about this topic today? Now, I've wanted to talk about this because, you know, a lot of the people coming to me are trying fasting, or they've never done it, or they're doing it incorrectly. So it's a really, you know, fasting can be such a powerful intervention when it comes to healing from chronic illness. You know, no matter whether that's like an inflammatory condition, whether it's a gut-based condition, whether it's a cardiometabolic type condition like diabetes or heart disease, it can be a really powerful intervention to use. So it can be used as like a treatment for these types of conditions, or it can be used like obviously to keep our wellness and keep us healthy, aside from, you know, treating illness. We should all generally be doing this. So, you know, fasting is like one of the most time-honored and widespread healing traditions in the world, and we've really just lost touch with that over time. You know, in every single religion, every culture in the world, fasting has been part of that at some point. And you know, I think the more as a culture, especially in our Western countries, we've become more distanced away from these sort of cultural traditional norms, religion particularly. You know, we've seen this drop off the picture a bit more, whereas we see in like Islamic religions, in Hinduism, in Catholicism, they still maintain some of these things. As we've, you know, just become disconnected, we've seen this disappear. But you know, it's so ingrained into our physiology, and so much about getting healthy again after being sick is just getting in touch with, you know, what we're effectively designed to do through evolution. You know, so genetically we haven't particularly changed since, you know, we were cavemen in our Paleolithic type times, whereas our lifestyle and our modern era is all the technology advancement and everything that's changed a lot. So we're still effectively like cavemen living in this highly evolved modern technological world, so not really adapted to that. So a lot of the time when we're trying to cultivate health again, it's just getting in touch with what we're effectively designed to be living by. You know, the types of things we eat, how much stress we have, how much physical activity we have. And fasting is one thing that was, you know, so critical, like so normal for us when we live like this. You know, food wasn't really readily available when we were hunter-gatherers. We had to go out and hunt for food, especially in the winter. It wasn't readily available. So we went through periods where it wasn't easy accessible, and we become very adapted to having that and not having food all the time. So our physiology is really set up for periods of no food. We're not designed to particularly eat 3 meals a day forever for our whole life. We're not designed to do that, and that's where we've seen tons and tons of issues come from. So, you know, as our life has become more convenient, we've had less scarcity, we've created more comfort in our lives. You know, drive-through foods, mass production, agriculture. We're not, you know, there's no danger of famine much anymore. There's no shortage of food. We can have it, like we click our phone and we get it delivered to our front door when we want it. You know, so it's all pushed out. All this convenience and things is pushed out things like fasting. So, you know, when we look at our ancestors, like, as humanity's evolved over time, you know, as we came out of these hunter-gatherer times, actually, you look at ancient Greeks and some of these older civilizations, they recognized the benefits of fasting. So they did maintain some voluntary fasting periods within their society. But, you know, fasting isn't particularly a fun thing to do. So it's, you know, it's easy to see how humans have, like, you know, stepped away from that over time. And as that's happened, we've got more comfort, eating more consistently, rates of obesity, chronic illness are all picking up. I was going to touch on another point there. But yeah, I'll come back to that. So, you know, unsurprisingly, you know, actually, yeah, that was it. So, you know, these 3 meals a day thing, that hasn't been with us for that long, actually. And it's been driven, like, the way we eat is driven so much by industry, you know, corporations wanting us to eat. And a lot of these industries have a powerful influence about, you know, the government's guidance on what we should be eating and how much we should be eating. And it's driven a lot of fear into the fasting picture. If you don't eat, you're going to die, like, you're going to be super hungry, you'll overeat to compensate and put all the weight back on, which isn't true. It's really not true, and we've known this in the research for a long time. But, you know, our awareness of maybe chronic illness, obesity, wasn't as much as it is now. You know, from the, like, early, you know, we have 2 world wars, rebounding out of that. It was only since the 1960s, 1970s that we started to become more aware of these issues. And funny enough, that's really where a lot of fasting really just disappears off the map. So when we look at the rates of obesity, putting on more weight, that's, you know, generally happened over the last 30 years. We've seen that skyrocket in all ages. And that correlates with most chronic illness as well. So funny enough, with the drop off of fasting in our society, we're starting to see more of this happen. And, you know, so we can see how this has become, like, this leads directly into, you know, talking about prevention for problems, like, so prevention for, you know, COVID-19 and long COVID and things like this. Like, we know that, you know, high blood glucose, insulin resistance, diabetes, cardiometabolic type issues are one major risk factor for, you know, severe reactions and severe complications from SARS-CoV-2 infection. And, you know, we've all been aware of, like, the obesity crisis, the diabetes crisis, heart disease crisis, really developing and picking up over time. But so many of us just don't correlate that with how we deal with, like, an infection from a virus. And what we know, what's well established, is that, you know, if you have cardiometabolic, blood glucose dysregulation, you're going to have immune problems as well. So we see how this directly leads into the long COVID-19 pandemic picture. Interestingly, like, you look at, like, the factors which affect the clearance rate of viral elements in the body, you know, high density cholesterol, HDL, is an important risk factor, is an important thing affecting that. So we look at the statement at the bottom: HDL, blood glucose, liver enzymes, the independent factors which influence how our body gets rid of viral things. And not many of us put that correlation together, how our, you know, what we eat with our sugar, and how much we're eating, our insulin status and immune status. So let's go through a little bit more, like, what the basis is and what the argument is for fasting with long COVID. And we're seeing this come into a lot of discussion with, like, past protocols to help with long COVID cases. There's a lot of discussion about, you know, detoxing from the spike and things like this. And so it's being talked about a lot and involved in a lot of protocols. So, and we can see a basis and mechanism of how fasting is going to help this population. So, you know, there's not really any research directly and specifically for fasting on specifically long COVID. Yeah, and that's just probably because we'll see that come in the future. It's just such a new thing. The studies haven't been completed yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see a study directly on these types of things soon. But we can look at the benefits of fasting anyway and see how that can be a plausible mechanism in helping this population. So we know that in long COVID, there's lots of inflammation happening. Autoimmunity is becoming a much more prevalent picture within long COVID. So there's lots of inflammation happening. And what we know about fasting is a very powerful anti-inflammatory. We also know that if we look at like similar populations, so people like populations like chronic fatigue, we know that chronic fatigue is often driven by inflammation. So again, coming back, fasting can be a possible mechanism to help with that. And fasting's been demonstrated to do a lot of different things. So fasting has been demonstrated to induce autophagy. And this is one thing that I think a lot of people are gripping onto when they come to regenerating and repairing, recovering from long COVID, is this autophagy effect. And autophagy, if you don't know that word, is effectively the body's natural process to clean out, repair. So clean out old, worn out fragments of cells, not very efficient parts of cells, regenerate the cell, so we have more highly functioning physiology. We can't do that when we're eating. So we have to give the body a bit of space so it can do that cleanup process. So effectively, when we are eating, that obviously causes our insulin to increase, especially if you're eating more higher GI type foods. And that stimulates something called the mTOR pathway. And the mTOR pathway is one of the main regulators for growth and autophagy, and something called apoptosis, which is like programmed cell death. And that's when we want to get rid of some of these older, worn out cells to make room for newer ones. So when we're eating, we get stimulation of mTOR. And when mTOR is stimulated and gets activated, we get more cellular growth. And that makes sense, because if we're eating food, we're taking in sugar, we're taking in fuel for the body, that's where it can start growing, right? Whereas when it's doing that, it's going to inhibit the cleanup process and the repair and the cleaning out process. It can't do both at the same time, like we talked about. So, this sort of links in a lot about the conversation with fasting, how it can maybe affect things like cancer. So, mTOR is very much implicated in the process of how cancer comes around. And with cancer, you'll see like dysregulation of that mTOR pathway. So we get sustained growth of the cell. And that, of course, forms tumors, and we get less of this autophagy effect. And we get uncontrolled growth happening. And that happens with this dysregulation of the mTOR pathway. So, fasting can be a very good way to maintain and prevent like uncontrolled cell growth, and just to get this more recycling and repair happening, which can prevent some of these issues. Whereas on the opposite, like we said, so the opposite to that is that when we're not eating, insulin dramatically decreases. And interestingly, when you look at some of these longer type fasts, although insulin decreases, we still get a regulation of the blood sugar, actually. So we don't typically get hypos too much if we're doing it properly. The body's very intelligent, it's very adapted to do this. So it will particularly maintain blood glucose through other mechanisms aside from food. It will draw out, break down proteins in the body, and proteins can be converted to glucose to maintain things like that. And that particularly a lot of the fear about fasting comes around, it's going to break down muscle. We're going to start breaking down protein, and that comes from muscles, that's not true, apart from if you go too far with this and you're like 4% below body fat, which is quite extreme and malnourished, and you shouldn't be fasting if you're like that. So when we're not eating food, insulin decreases, we get a down regulation of this mTOR pathway. and therefore we don't get this sustained growth, but we actually get this space allowing for this autophagy effect. And that's where particularly we get cellular regeneration. So if you've had a lot of inflammation happening around the body, whatever condition that's part of, you see a lot of this with long COVID, but also any type of autoimmune condition, any inflammatory condition, which is generally, most things, you're going to get a lot of damage and cellular damage with that. It kicks off a lot of oxidative stress, which can damage cells and tissues around the body. So, we want some of this recycling and regeneration to happen when we're coming out of illness. And interestingly, this is why it's part of, if you may not have heard of this doctor called Dale Bredesen, and he's the pioneer of reversing Alzheimer's now. He's introduced a protocol which has been shown to effectively reverse Alzheimer's, which is previously unheard of. And this is all through these types of things, all through lifestyle change, nutrition, supplementation, and fasting is a big part of this. And that's because we get this autophagy effect. And autophagy can, the same thing in the rest of the body, in the brain, we can get a clearing out of the buildup of toxins, which can drive Alzheimer's forward. We get a cleaning out of the amyloid proteins. And generally you see that clearing out of amyloid before generally fasting will be more effective at that before Alzheimer's, more so preventing Alzheimer's, it can be very effective for. When we get Alzheimer's, we do get a dysregulation of the buildup of amyloids and beta and proteins like this. So it gets a little bit more complex when you have reached that, but it's still part of this protocol because of the benefits it has. We know Alzheimer's, it's labeled diabetes type 3. And that's because insulin and all the things we've been talking about play a direct role in actually in Alzheimer's development. So the belief that, this is a bit of a sidetrack, but the belief that Alzheimer's, there's nothing you can do about it, that's outdated now. There's things you can do for this. And there's obviously, it depends how advanced that gets, but you can actually do something for Alzheimer's now. And it's all the same with all types of other types of chronic illness. When we start developing these methods of changing lifestyle, changing environmental factors, creating an environment for the body to do some cleanup, to heal, to return to balance and homeostasis, it has a tremendous ability to regenerate. So there's a big autophagy question with this. So like we said, if we've had a lot of inflammation, we want some cleanup process to happen. But aside from that, fasting, itself reduces inflammation, is very powerful anti-inflammatory. And a lot of that comes around through what we call balancing the redox status in the body. So, and that's effectively coming back to this oxidative stress and antioxidant picture. So with inflammation, we get a lot of pro-oxidant factors. We get oxidation of proteins in the body. We get oxidation of lipids. And our body will deal with that with antioxidants. So you need antioxidants to mop up the oxidants. And so our body has a natural ability to do that. We can obviously get antioxidants from food, but our body actually can generate its own antioxidants. And what we see with fasting is that it increases our total antioxidant capacity. And all of that is based in the plasma, which the plasma in our blood has quite a lot of antioxidant properties. And we can see this effect coming around. So we get a decrease in these lipid peroxidations. We get a decrease in NF-kappa B, which is one of the major regulators and promoters of inflammation in the body. And we get an increase of NRF2, which is more the pathway and regulator of antioxidants. So it has an impact on inflammation. And interestingly, when you see this increase in antioxidants in the body with fasting, you actually see a lot of the time is you actually get also a lot of increases in uric acid. And this is a point in that some people with gout need to take care with fasting, because there's a thought that, if we're boosting up antioxidants and uric acid, that can maybe perpetuate the gout. But it's an interesting point. And what we know about gout and uric acid is, like, uric acid is actually an antioxidant. And so it gathers in the place where we see more of this oxidation taking place. So, it's concentrated on a lot with gout because, that's what we measure to diagnose it and monitor it. But the uric acid is not the cause of gout. That's providing an antioxidant function, and it's in that location trying to clean up the inflammation. There's other causes to gout. It's not the uric acid. But I thought it was an interesting point to bring in there. So going back to other benefits of fasting, so we get an increase in BDNF, and BDNF is brain-derived neurotropic factors. So BDNF really drives the neural regeneration that takes place. So when we're talking about, linking back to Alzheimer's, BDNF critically important for that, right? So we get neurodegeneration. We want regeneration to take place again, driving processes like BDNF. When we've had things like long COVID, like we know with long COVID, it can really impact the brain. A lot of people get a lot of anxiety, depression, neuroinflammation happening, and that really can lead to a lot of a degeneration effect in the brain. And that's one particular reason with these sustained smell and taste impacts of long COVID, when people don't get the taste and smell back. And that's because at a brain level, there's been this degeneration effect happening. So the brain's no longer perceiving correctly the sensation information coming through. So the brain is a big area target with this, and fasting can be one thing to increase that. And then we also get mitochondrial regeneration. So similar to the autophagy effect, where we get a cleaning out, regeneration of old debris and cell, we'll see that in the mitochondria as well. So the energy producing structures in our body. So effectively, when we look at mitochondria, they tend to fluctuate through this state of being fissioned, fused or fissioned. So when they're in this fused state, they're more in this large whole state, and that's when they're very effective and efficient at producing energy. They're at a high energy production state when they're in this fused state. However, as they have been working for a bit of time, a lot of oxidation can happen with the mitochondria, with the production of ATP and energy. Burning glucose can produce a lot of collateral damage and free radicals. So it does need to go through this fission state to start, same as autophagy, start cleaning out older parts of the cell, of the structure. So it will basically split apart, take out older, less efficient parts that are a bit worn out, and then it can fuse again into this more whole state and regenerate. So, obviously fatigue being a massive part of long COVID, mitochondrial function is one of the main mechanisms occurring there. And that's a lot of the time because the virus attacks the mitochondria itself. It hijacks the mitochondria. Inflammation, we know, really clogs up our energy production. But fasting can, be one thing to regenerate the mitochondria, so we're in a better energy production state. And that, applies to many other diff types of condition as well. So a lot of pain type issues tend to have a mitochondrial process involved within that. And fatigue, of course. And also, we tend to see mitochondrial issues show up with three areas. So pain, altered sensation, brain-based issues, because the brain and nervous system are very energy dependent structures, and also drains, so fatigue. So there's a lot of benefit going on here. There's so much changes that can happen in the body, and you will get different amounts of this stuff depending on how long you fast. So generally what we see is with the shorter fasts, we'll start to get over 12 hours, we'll see the gut turn off. It'll stop digestion because it's not full of food. It can start repairing a little bit. Growth hormone can start picking up, our testosterone start picking up, and that makes sense. Overnight when we sleep, generally when we're doing it overnight, 12 hours most of us do, between breakfast and dinner the night before. It's usually around 12 hours, and that makes sense with the growth hormone picking up there. It's when our body does its growth, right? We all know that. And that's because, you know, we're getting a little bit of fasting window, growth hormone picks up, so the body is starting to do some repair and rebuilding. However, if we push that forward, we start to see some really interesting changes. We start to see more of this sort of autophagy begin with the 24-hour longer fasts. And you tend to not see that too much with the sort of just 12, 16 hours. You have to go 24, 36-hour type fast to start to see that. And that's when really the body can start doing its cleaning out, its regeneration. When we start getting like 48 hours plus, we start to see, you know, a huge impact on the immune system. The immune system can reset, it can regenerate. And so that starts to become a very interesting discussion when we're talking about something like autoimmunity or something very immune driven or inflammation driven. It can be a huge dampening switch to that whole process. So a lot of people just aren't doing fasting enough. You know, they tend to do like a 16-hour, but to get some of these more powerful impacts, we tend to need to go a little bit further. And again, like a lot of us, you know, we're very adapted to do that. But we'll go through a little bit, you know, how and when to do that a little bit more. So before we run out the door and like, you know, go and jump into fasting and just start doing it straight away, you know, it is good to know a little bit more about it and how to do it properly, because plenty of people are doing this incorrectly or too much. So there's some things to know about fasting, especially when it comes to something like long COVID. You know, firstly, you know, what we know about this population is they don't regulate very well. They really don't deal with a little bit more stress on the system. You know, they get a lot of like uncontrolled palpitations, cold intolerance, temperature just fluctuations, shortness of breath, anxiety coming out of nowhere. So, you know, the body's not regulating well at all. So to throw fasting on top of that, you know, it's a little bit, it's hard for the body to do that, because the body's going to have to adapt to that and regulate. It's going to have to maintain its blood sugar levels. It's going to have to maintain electrolytes in the blood. So putting that onto someone who's not regulating very well often is not the best idea. And we'll go through a little bit more what we can do for that. And it sort of applies a little bit to doing this with like a diabetic. You know, the diabetic person isn't regulating their blood sugar well. So if you throw fasting onto them, the complication of that is, you know, they can get hypoglycemia, which is a dangerous thing for them. So we want to make sure we're regulating a bit better when we start doing this. If fasting, when we're trying to fast, stress and like when you mental health issues aren't great to have if you're going to fast. Like, you know, it is hard work, and it can, you know, with not having food available, it can drive some problems with mental health if you're a bit unstable mentally. You know, it comes back to this regulation thing. If you're not keeping yourself stable, if you're full of anxiety, it's often not a good place to do fasting. You know, it's good to have a much calmer state where we feel a bit more balanced, in control. Generally, if we can maintain our emotions, if we're not full of anxiety, our blood sugars will reflect that. We tend to, when we get lots of stress going on, that's one thing that will really affect the success of fasting. And often people will fall off a fasting regime because they get stressed with something. And that's because it has a direct impact on our physiology, our physical impact, a physical state. And that makes sense. You know, if we get stressed with anxiety, we're almost running from that tiger, right? We're in that fight or flight. And the body, when it's in that, it really needs quick fuel to do that, because it thinks it needs to run or fight. So that's where we really start to crave, you know, sweet things. We crave a little bit of food to sustain that. So that's often one thing that will impact that. Not, you know, a lot of the anxiety with long COVID is obviously driven by the physical pathology of it, like the inflammation and neuroinflammation happening. But you know, there's also, you know, so much anxiety around just lack of clarity about what's going on, feeling out of control, not getting help from the doctor, your mainstream doctor. feeling like, you know, your whole world's been turned upside down. So apart from the physical processes happening with the condition, there's also a big mental side to that, and that's something to address a little bit before you start jumping into this. And then, you know, a lot of people, you know, are typically lost a lot of weight. I've worked with a few people who have really lost a lot of weight. You know, when we're starting, if we're losing tons of weight, we're approaching, you know, very low weight. We don't want to restrict the diet much, and that's why, you know, things like being malnourished, being very low weight is really a contraindication for fasting. You know, if you're underweight, we want to put more weight on. That's going to help more than fasting. So, you know, and it all comes back to, like, with the regulation thing, is fasting is a form of stress on the body. You know, it's like we touched upon this before Christmas in our cold therapy talk. So if you haven't seen that, that is on YouTube, the recording. So we touch upon this, and we think we mentioned fasting in there. The same as cold therapy. It is, you know, although it's a healthy thing, it's a healthy thing because it induces a little bit of stress on the body, and a lot of the beneficial effects happen because it does induce a little bit of stress, and that little bit of stress is enough to trigger the benefits we see, like increases of antioxidants. So if you're not in the capacity and state to take on more stress, then it's maybe not something to do yet. So, and this sort of reiterates my point, is that, you know, when we're going into a fasting state, that can actually produce a little bit of free radicals, some of these pro-oxidant factors. And it's those pro-oxidant factors which induce, secondary is our antioxidant defenses. And this is what we see with cold therapy, types of foods that are healthy for us, is they trigger a little bit of stress, a little bit of inflammation, and that triggers our body's natural defenses and natural processes to rebound in response to that. So, you know, how can you implement this a little bit more successfully, whether you have long COVID or a different type condition? There's a few things to get in place before you start jumping into this. So, you know, the first thing, you know, I have to say is obviously consult your doctor. Like most people with long COVID or other types of conditions, you're taking medication, and, you know, a lot of this medication has to be taken with food. So if you are in that state, you want to have a conversation with your doctor how you can maybe do something like this while you're taking medication, because you are at more of a risk of getting side effects from some types of medication or even supplements if you're not eating. Particularly the gut tends to get affected more when we're taking these things without food. And especially the diabetic, if you're diabetic, you want to, and you know, obviously, like we talked about, you're not regulating blood glucose well. If you stop eating, there's a danger of getting too hypoglycemic. So you have to really monitor your blood glucose levels, monitor your blood pressure quite consistently as you're doing that. So, you know, if you do have a condition, if you are taking medication, you want to approach this stuff, then you want to consult your doctor first. So what else can you do? So first thing is get yourself stable. So often when some people come to us with long COVID or another type of condition, and often when we first start out with them, there's symptoms absolutely everywhere. There's raging inflammation, really uncontrolled inflammation. And the first thing we tend to do is actually get them a little bit stable before we start approaching things like fasting. You know, fasting can be a very powerful anti-inflammatory. So, you know, we want to do some of that at some point, but we've often found that if we start supporting things like much more antioxidants, really start using anti-inflammatory interventions just to get a little bit of control of the situation, and that's going to just help someone to feel a little bit more stable and not so out of control and then they can start taking on a little bit more stress, and that's how you start building things up. So, you know, as part of that, you want to improve your overall staple diet around the fasting. So, when you're not fasting, you want to think about obviously what you're eating. So you want to make sure you're getting lots of antioxidants in the diet. You're eating more anti-inflammatory foods, following something like a paleo type diet, which is very nutritionally dense. Because when we're recovering from something like long COVID or chronic illness, we do need a lot of nutrients, and our body needs to build up again. So it needs nutrients to do that. So if you're still like following a very conventional Western British diet, then and that's going to be full of things that are promoting inflammation. So you want to improve your staple diet around that. And that may be something to get in place first, and that's going to help yourself get a bit more stable and set up before you start approaching this. And learn to find some calmness. So especially if you have long COVID, like I touched upon, like there's a lot of anxiety from the sheer lack of clarity, uncontrolled atmosphere around the whole pandemic, the condition. So you need to find, just from a mental standpoint, a little bit of calmness. Stop reading every single article, researching to death, obsessing over your problem. It just generates more and more anxiety, and it's very hard for us to repair and recover when we're fighting the tiger, running from the tiger. So I think a lot of patients come to me as well. A lot of them I've had the discussion with Facebook groups, and these communities of people have been absolute havens for them in getting acknowledgement and support. But you're getting consistent updates of opinions, latest research, news, which are all triggering this sympathetic stress state. So it's good to have some boundaries with what you're exposing yourself to, and try and cultivate some sense of calm within your struggle. If you can start integrating things like meditation, yoga, gentle movements, breathing patterns, getting out in nature, just find some sort of routine which does bring you down, gets you a bit more reconnected. You'll be in a much better place to approach recovering if you can do that, and everyone can do that. Next thing, start small. So most of us in like UK, Western world, we've never fasted our entire life, which is crazy when we start, when we talk about how much has been part of our physiology. We've eaten 3 meals from day one. It's crazy. So if you've never done it, start small. Don't jump into a 24, 36-hour fast. You want to build up a little bit to it. So, start doing just 16 hours overnight, delay breakfast or skip breakfast, go to lunch. And, you just build up your comfort levels you start to build confidence in it. You start to realize that, you're not actually feeling hungry. It's just your brain telling you, oh, it's time to eat, because it's so used to doing that. And once you start to recognize that, you can start to recognize, actually, I'm functioning absolutely fine. Like, I feel fine. I'm not about to chew someone's arm off. There's a huge difference between being hungry and your brain telling you it's time to eat, and wanting food, and just being that automatic hamster wheel of eating without really thinking. So start small. Start with a few, like 12, 16 hours, push that through to 24 hours, and you'll be surprised actually how easy it is, and how how actually adapt, and how well our body copes with this stuff, and we start to appreciate actually what our body can do when it needs to. And I think that in itself can cultivate a lot of more confidence when you're going through something like this. Is actually the body has such a massive capacity to survive and overcome challenges, and that in itself can reduce a lot of anxiety, I think. Once we get to 24 hours, then you can approach these more longer type fasts, but you want to just make sure you don't overdo it. So apart from the people who are never done this at all, there's a population of people who are just doing way too much. We have this I think as human beings, we have this thing as we just take things to extremes a little bit. When we hear something can be effective for a problem, we tend to see that as like a cure, and we jump and latch onto it, and we go way overboard with it. And you shouldn't really be looking at fasting as a cure. This isn't like a silver bullet cure. This is about cultivating a lifestyle, cultivating an environment for your body to regenerate. That's how you should look at chronic illness, rather than looking for silver bullet cures. So fasting can be part of your setup and environment, which supports that whole process. So, you don't want to be doing, 24, 36-hour fast every week. We can do that for a certain amount of time. It's amazing what we can do, but you reach a point where your body, you're not getting the nutrients it needs. It's getting too stressful for the body to maintain. You're starting to get out of what we're, from evolution designed to do. We had periods of fasting, but then we had feast. So, we can do that too much. So typically what I'm recommending people is do like, once a week, 16 hours, once every month, go for one of these longer fasts. And that's very sustainable. And if you can get this sustainable routine in your life, then you'll start to see, your progress will start making trends upwards over time. And just research a bit more, get organized, start reading a bit more. Now, what are you going to actually eat and drink when you do a fast? Are you going to do like nothing at all, which I wouldn't recommend? So the more like advanced ones is like a water only fast, which is pretty tough. But you can get all these benefits from just taking things like bone broth, which are full of like really good nutrients, which makes you feel satiated, supports everything your body needs to do. You can use herbal teas. You can even use coffee. So, a lot of these non-caloric liquids can be used within this. So, you don't want to use things like juice too much. You'll get more effect and benefit through things like tea, coffee, and something like bone broth. Although for me, I know I'm terrible on tolerating coffee. It sends me overboard, so I don't use coffee. I use more teas. But yeah, there's so much there's so much resources on the internet and people to follow to just read around it a little bit more. I'd recommend someone called Jason Fung. He's got a really good book on fasting, tells you, what the protocols are, what to do it a little bit more. And I'm sure he's online somewhere. So I'd recommend following him if you want to do it a little bit more. So I think that's everything I wanted to go through with you. So, hopefully that opens your eyes a little bit more to like the effects of fasting, how it could benefit your situation, and introduce you to thinking a little bit about it a little bit more, and how you can bring that into your tool set and your arsenal for, recovering from whatever situation you're in. So, if you have any questions, as usual, please do, you can write in the chat or open yourself up from your mic and we can do a few Q&As.
Hi, Jamie. Just a quick question. Can you take supplements when you're fasting? Because a lot of them say take with food.
Yeah. So linking back to what I said about some things that is supposed to be taken with food. So things like magnesium and iron can be a bit more problematic when you're fasting. It will impact the gut a little bit more, and you can get some discomfort and issues there. So that's, usually with iron, you just get more discomfort. With magnesium, that can induce a lot more like loose stools, diarrhea. That's part of its function anyway. If we want to take it, it can induce that, but you'll just see that enhanced a little bit more if you're not taking it with food, potentially. But yeah, and absolutely, you can take supplements with food. I think the record for fasting is something like 382 days. And the guy that did that took a multivit every day. And so it's actually quite a good idea to, if you're doing like a longer type fast, like 36 hours, 48 hours plus, a multivit can be quite useful because it covers obviously all your body's nutrient needs within that at a basic level. So yeah, you can do it. There's just a few others that can cause some irritation, some issues with that. But it's, more drugs, medications are probably more of an issue.